Hi everyone, welcome to our lecture on clustering. This is the second lecture in which we talk about more advanced techniques for data clustering. Just as a recap, we saw last time that the objective behind clustering is we have a data set and we want to divide individual data instances into groups that are similar to one another. Because of this, clustering is more of a descriptive analytics approach that tries to explain and summarize a particular data set. We also discussed last time that clustering is an unsupervised approach. That's because we don't have a teacher to train our model. So essentially the concepts that we talk about in terms of cutting the data into training set and test set or validation set doesn't really apply here because we don't know what the true class or cluster of each individual data instance is. So essentially we try to define a distance metric, and using that distance metric we would like to combine and cluster data instances that are closer to one another within a particular group or segment. Now, before we get started with the main topic of today's lecture, which is more advanced techniques for clustering, let's have a quick recap of what we talked about last time. In the last lecture, we discussed representative-based clustering as one of the most common techniques for clustering algorithms. The idea here is that for each class or each cluster, you want to find a representative that has the least distance with all other data points in that particular cluster. Mathematically speaking, what we want to do is we want to find a way to partition this data set that I'm given into k clusters in such a way that the distances within each cluster would be minimized. This means that all the data instances within a cluster are very, very similar to one another, and they are very dissimilar from the other data instances that do not belong to that cluster. We saw that there are different variations of this method. You could have k-means, you could have k-medians, or k-medoids. And we also discussed that solving the direct optimization problem, meaning that finding a way to partition all the data set into k clusters is actually very difficult to solve mathematically. And as a result, what we do is we find an iterative approach. Now, in this iterative approach, again, to kind of summarize what we talked about last time, you would initially randomly select k data points, and you will say these k data points are the k representatives of my data set. So each data point that I have chosen randomly would be a representative of a cluster. And then what I do is I assign every data point to the representative to which it is closest. So that will be the cluster the data instance will belong to. Once you have formed the clusters that way, you will then update the representative for that cluster. And then you continue this process through an iteration until you see little or no changes in the representatives of those clusters. When that happens, you realize that the clusters have converged to the optimum solution, or I should perhaps say local optimum solution, because there is no global solution for this optimization problem. Let's look at it through this example. Imagine I have these individual data instances. Obviously, you can see here that these belong to three clusters or three groups of red, blue, and green. We do realize, however, clustering is an unsupervised approach, meaning that your algorithm doesn't know about this. Your algorithm does not know which data instance is blue, which one is red, which one is green. From the perspective of your algorithm, it'll just try to find the data instances that are closest to one another and say, hey, you guys belong to this cluster. But we look at the colors just for kind of, demonstration purposes. So imagine this is a data set that I have, and let's say that my k here is 3, meaning that I know that I have to divide this data set into 3 clusters. Now, using that iterative approach, the first thing that I do is I will choose 3 data points randomly, and I say you 3 are the representatives of these 3 clusters. Let me actually pick a different color, which is easier to detect. Let's say, as an example, I randomly choose this guy, and I don't know, let's say this guy and this guy. You might think that these are too close to one another, sure, but I have no other idea how I should do that because it's a completely random selection. Once I do this, then I will look at every individual data instance and try to see which of these three representatives the data instance is closest to. Whichever representative this is closest to, it'll belong to that particular cluster. So you can probably see in this example that these five, or rather four guys are closest to this representative. I would probably say, again, roughly speaking, I would say that maybe these guys would be closest to this representative, and then for the sake of example, let's say these guys would be closest to this representative. Now, this obviously is not a very good clustering approach, as you can see, because I have one cluster here which consists of both blue and red, and then I have some blue here combined with green, but that's okay. That's the first iteration. Now that I have this, what I will do is I will go back to each cluster and I say, let's recalculate the representative of each one. So for example, and let me choose a different color here. So let's go with light blue. Let's take a look at the cluster at the top. If I want to find a point in this space which has the least amount of distances with all the other data instances, again, as an example, let's say it would be this point here, right? And if I do it for this cluster, would be this guy, and let's say for this cluster, it would be this guy. Okay, and you notice something immediately here, that these light blue points that I drew here, these do not belong to the data set. These are not actual data points, and that's fine because these are centroid representatives, meaning that they represent the cluster without being a part of that cluster. The opposite of that, of course, you probably remember from our discussion last time, that would be a metoid, which actually does belong to the data set. But let's go with a centroid example, which is easier. Now I have calculated the new representatives of these clusters that I just formed. With these individuals at hand right now, what I will do is I will reassign all the data instances into the new clusters. So let's say when I do this, let's start with this guy. So I want to know what points are closest to this representative as opposed to the other two. In this case, you can probably see that these two guys, these three guys rather, this one, and this one are perhaps closest to this than to this. And then perhaps these points would be closest. Let's actually number them so it's easier to follow. So 1, 2. So these points would be closest to 2. And again, for the sake of example, let's see that these points would be closest to 3. Now, what you notice here is that the clusters are starting to take a more reasonable form, meaning that now more red data points are kind of combining together and more blue data points are combining together. So you can see that, for example, there is more homogeneity here as opposed to the previous cluster. And then you continue this process. Let's say, again, let me pick another color. So if I now, for the new clusters that I have formed, if I try to find the representatives, perhaps let's say for this cluster, this would be the new representative. For this cluster, perhaps this would be the new representative. And for this third cluster, I don't know, probably somewhere here. Just as an example, right? Now, if I do one more round of assigning data points to the new clusters, most likely I will have perhaps, let's say, this additional red data point belonging to this cluster, and then certainly this blue point will belong to this cluster, and then these green ones belong to this cluster. So you can see that basically through that iteration, the clusters, take a reasonable form. That, of course, as we talked about it last time, that doesn't happen all the time because it always depends on your initial condition. If you are unlucky in your initial, random selection of your representatives, it's possible that even after like hundreds of iterations, the clusters really don't take the correct form, and you will have a bunch of data instances in each cluster that are not really similar to one another. So that was a quick recap of what we talked about last time as related to representative-based clustering. Now let's move on to a couple of new and interesting techniques. Another interesting approach for clustering is hierarchical clustering. Now this tries to solve one of the problems associated with representative-based clustering. Probably one thing that bothered you when I discussed representative-based clustering was the fact that I said you have to identify how many clusters you want to have beforehand. Naturally, if I don't have enough information about the data, this is not easy to determine. I mean, if I give you a data set, how do you know if you have to divide it into 5 clusters or 10 clusters or 2 clusters? That's one of the disadvantages associated with representative-based clustering. Hierarchical approaches try to address that. So instead of you having to specify beforehand how many clusters you want to have, you basically decide on that using a tree-based model that is known as a dendrogram. Based on that dendrogram, you then decide what is a reasonable number of clusters for this particular data set. Now, dendrogram is a tree diagram in which every data instance is one of the leaves. So A, B, C, D, E, F, each of them is an individual data instance and would be a leaf of this tree. When you move up this tree, some of the leaves, the ones that are more similar to one another, they merge into branches. For example, as I move up, B and C kind of join together, merge into one branch or a cluster. Then you continue to move up, and let's say the cluster that contains B and C will then merge with the cluster that contains, for example, data point A. Here, essentially the height at which these branches merge indicates how different the data instances are. So when you look at B and C, and let's say these are 2 data instances, I calculate the distance between the 2, and that distance turns out to be 0.8. So then I will say I will merge these 2 guys at a height of 0.8. And let's say you look at the cluster that consists of B and C and want to know how distant this is from point A, and let's say you calculate that distance and it turns out to be 1.4. You then connect that cluster to point A at a height of 1.4. So the height essentially tells you how different or how similar individual data instances or clusters are. When you merge data instances or clusters at lower levels of the tree, that indicates that they are pretty similar to one another. For example, if B and C would have been merged at a point of, let's say, 0.1, that would have meant that the distance between the 2 is just 0.1, meaning that the 2 are very close to one another. On the other hand, when merging happens near the top of the tree, it's basically telling you that these data instances or these clusters are not very similar, are quite different. So here, for example, notice that the cluster that consists of A, B, and C here merges with the cluster that consists of D, E, and F here at a height of 2. So that basically tells you that it is true that they have merged eventually, but the distance between them is relatively large. So that means that they are not necessarily close to one another or similar to one another. So just to recap, when you're looking at this dendrogram, and this, by the way, is something that you can create using MATLAB or R or Python, so it's not something that you would have to create by hand. When you look at this dendrogram, the distance on the vertical axis essentially is indicating the distance between the clusters or the distance between individual data instances. And then the horizontal distance, like this distance here, doesn't really indicate anything. So for example, if E was here, E and F were here, and D was on the other side, it wouldn't have made a difference. So horizontal axis, do not interpret it in any way. It's not indicating anything. Vertical axis, on the other hand, is indicating distance. So for example, if you want to know how D and E are different, you basically see the distance between D and E would be this much. So this is your distance. Or for example, how different D is with respect to C, this would be the distance between the two. So this is the notion of dendrogram, which is kind of the foundation of hierarchical clustering. Now, as I was explaining how we calculate the distances, maybe some of you started wondering how you would calculate the distance between multiple clusters. Because look, if I have a data instance here and a data instance here, obviously for us is very simple to understand what this distance is. If it's the Euclidean distance, you look at, for example, the coordinate of x1 minus x2, 2 norm. If it's the Manhattan distance, it would be the 1 norm of that. So for individual data instances, that's actually quite easy to understand. The question, however, would be, what if I want to measure the distance between a data instance and a cluster, or the distances between multiple clusters? How would I do that? Let me take you back to the previous slide just so I clarify what I mean. Imagine, or rather, let me redraw this here. So let's say I have point A and B and C. So let's say B and C are very close to one another, very similar to one another. So the distance between them is very small. Now I have a cluster of two data instances B and C, and then I want to know what is the distance between that cluster. This kind of looks like a happy face, but what I meant to say is that's data point B and that's data point C. So what I want to know is, what is the distance between this guy and the cluster? So how would I calculate, for example, at what distance these two should be merged to one another? That's something that we have to address when it comes to hierarchical clustering. And actually, there are several approaches for that. These are known as the linkage function that give us a measure of dissimilarity between different data instances. There are several approaches that we can basically use to calculate the linkage or the dissimilarity between two clusters. One of them is the single linkage, which I'm showing here. Single linkage is basically the smallest pairwise distance between elements of each cluster. So in this green cluster that consists of 4 data points and the blue cluster that consists of another 4 data points, the single linkage is the shortest distance between them, which obviously, as you can see, would be the distance between this data point and this data point. Complete linkage, on the other hand, is the opposite of that. Complete linkage is the largest pairwise distance among all the elements of the two clusters. So the longest distance between elements of this cluster green and cluster blue would be the distance between this guy and this guy. So that's my complete linkage. We also can measure the average linkage, in which case, as I'm showing it here, you will measure the distance of all the possible pairs between cluster green and cluster blue. You measure all these distances, and then you divide them by the number of distances. So for example, if this guy has 4 data points and this one has 4 data points, you essentially would have to calculate 16 distances between all the points in green and all the points in blue, add them together, divided by 4 times 4, which is 16. Lastly, we have the centroid linkage, in which we calculate the centroid, or the mean of cluster green and the mean of cluster blue, and then we measure the distance between the two means. So these are the 4 different ways through which we can measure the distance or dissimilarity between clusters. And of course, in this diagram, I'm showing you, two clusters. It could be a cluster and a data point. So for example, if this is one cluster consisting of 5 points and then an individual data point, the single linkage would be the distance between this guy and perhaps this guy, which is the shortest distance. Complete linkage probably would be between this and this, which is the maximum distance. Centroid linkage, you just find the centroid of this cluster and then find the distance between that point and the centroid. And average, you would just find the distance of that individual point to all the 5 points within that cluster and then add them together, divided by 5, and that would be the average linkage. All right, now hierarchical clustering can be implemented in different ways. One of the approaches is known as the agglomerative or the bottom-up approach, and the other one is divisive or top-down. Agglomerative is when you build the tree from bottom up, meaning that every individual data instance would be a leaf of the tree, and then you start merging them and merging them and merging them and merging them, and then you continue this until you get to a point that all of them are merged into one cluster, which is again your original data set. Divisive or top-down approach is the opposite. You build the tree from top down, meaning that initially all the data instances belong to the same set, which is your data set. Let's call it a single cluster. And then you kind of, split them into two. So you have a bunch of data points here and a bunch of data points here. And then these guys will be split to, a couple here and one here. And these guys would split to like 1 and 2. And then these two will split up, and this will remain the same, and this will split up. So you started from kind of the trunk of the tree, and then you kind of build your way all the way through the branches towards individual leaves. Agglomerative clustering is more common, so that's what we talk about. We'll discuss today. Essentially, the approach that we have is you will initialize all the clusters to be individual data instances. So this, I'm discussing the diagram on the left. So every individual data instance is a cluster of its own first. These would be the leaves. This would be level 0. And then you look at all the pairs of these leaves, and you find the ones that are closest to one another, meaning that they have the lowest linkage function between them. Let's say it's these guys here. So I merge them like this. You then continue. Then you say, okay, I have a, let me actually maybe draw this here, start from scratch so it makes more sense. So let's say I have this, 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 and this. These are my initial data points, and these are individual clusters. Then I will say, okay, these two guys are closest to one another. And then I will start again finding pairwise distances. So I say, what's the linkage function or distance between this cluster and this guy, this cluster and this guy, this cluster and this guy, and also this guy and this guy, this guy and this guy. So all the pairs of possible data instances and clusters, I have to find the distances or linkage function between them. Let's say the next closest one would be this data point, which is closest to this individual cluster. I merge them, and again, let's assume that the linkage function is at some value, so I merge them at that height. Assume that, again, I now have a cluster and a data point and a data point. So again, I look at these three entities and find the pairwise distances. Let's say these two guys are the closest, the next closest to one another. So these would be their own cluster, and then lastly, I would merge them here. You might be wondering if it always happens as neatly as I'm showing you here, which the answer is no. We usually show it that way for demonstration purposes. Otherwise, it's possible. Let me give you another example. Let's say it's possible that these two guys are closest. Again, I emphasize, remember that the vertical distance is the distance between the data instances, or distance between the clusters. So let's say these two guys are the closest. The next closest would be these two guys. And then let's say the next closest pairs would be this cluster and this cluster, which is like this. And then I will combine these together, right? This would be a correct approach too. It's just that, as you can see, it's visually a little bit confusing because the lines kind of cross one another. Because of this, typically when you use hierarchical clustering in MATLAB or Python, what the software does, it actually reshuffles the data points in such a way that you get a neat diagram like this. And this is exactly why I was mentioning in the previous slide that don't read too much into the horizontal ordering. That doesn't mean anything. That's just for ease of representation. Otherwise, where, for example, point A is versus point E, it doesn't really matter. It could be anywhere. Now, I mentioned earlier that one of the benefits of hierarchical clustering is that you don't have to decide on K, the number of clusters, beforehand. What does that mean? Essentially, once you have created your dendrogram, you will then decide how many clusters you want. For example, in this case, if I cut my dendrogram from here, it'll give me two clusters that would consist of these data points and these data points. Another example, if I cut my dendrogram from here, then I will have this cluster, and a cluster consisting of D, E, and F. So you might wonder what makes me choose one number of clusters over another. That's basically the distance. So in the case on the left, in which I chose two clusters, basically I'm looking at this dendrogram and it's telling me that these two clusters have a distance of 2 with respect to one another, right? On the other hand, if I'm looking at this second example, the distance between the clusters is 1.2 or something. So in the case on the right, I have more number of clusters and they are kind of closest to one another. So you can imagine, for instance, I have this and this and this. Naturally, these two guys are relatively close to one another. And this one is perhaps not as close to the other two, but it's still relatively close. Now this way, I'm having more clusters, but then I'm running the risk of having clusters of data points that have too much similarity with one another, right? And the case on the left, on the other hand, what I did was I chose two clusters that perhaps consist of this and this. So now the distance between the clusters, the two clusters, would be higher. Again, notice that the vertical distance is a dissimilarity, but you basically have less number of clusters, meaning that these data points are added together. They belong to the same cluster. Now, there are some practical considerations about hierarchical clustering. One which is quite important is that this clustering approach is based on dendrograms, and dendrograms are deterministic models, meaning that they always create clusters for you, even if there is no clear pattern in the data. So even if the data instances have nothing to do with one another, they have no similarity with one another, dendrogram is still going to create some sort of a tree-like structure. It's just that the distances between the points would be higher, meaning that individual points would be connected at higher levels of the vertical axis. That's an important aspect to remember. The second consideration to have is that when we call this a hierarchical clustering, it means that clusters are nested within one another, meaning that you have some data points that are clustered, and then they were clustered with one another. So it's like they're nested within a kind of a larger cluster. Is this always the case? Not necessarily. Imagine this example. Imagine you have some students that, for example, are studying electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, chemical engineering, and then they're studying medicine and dentistry, right? This has some sort of a natural nesting to it, because you could say, for example, that EE students and ME students and what was the other one I said? Chemical student. Chemie students would be clustered into engineering cluster, and then, for example, medical students and those who study dentistry would be, for example, under medicine, right? So this has some sort of a nesting to it, and then you can say engineering and medicine, I combine it into higher education, right? That's a natural nesting within those clusters. Now imagine another scenario in which you have a series of, for example, EE and ME and Chemie students who are boys and girls. So here, boys, or rather gender and major, they don't really have anything to do with one another. There is really no relationship between the two. It's not like you should divide them based on whether they are men or women, and then divide men into EE, ME, Chemie, and women into EE, ME, Chemie. Essentially, for this data set, there are two possible solutions. One is that you have two clusters of men and women, or you have three clusters of EEs and MEs and Chemies. Hierarchical clustering, on the other hand, it doesn't understand this. So it might actually create a cluster of, for example, majors, which is now nested within a cluster of gender, which in this particular case would not make much sense. So that's something you have to keep in mind, that every time you want to use hierarchical clustering, make sure you have a clear understanding of your data set. Make sure that there is clear pattern into this data set, number one. And second, the clusters are actually have some sort of a nesting with respect to one another. The choice of linkage function is actually quite important. Some functions are more sensitive to noisy data. For example, if you look at, imagine you have these data sets, like, right, these clusters. In this case, you could use, any one of those functions that we talked about, right? You can use single linkage, you can use complete linkage, and so on. However, if one of the clusters has a, outlier here, for example, this is your cluster, then all of a sudden it will significantly affect the complete distance. Or if the cluster has an outlier, so this is my main data points, and then I have an outlier here, it will significantly affect the single linkage. So that's something that you have to keep in mind. If you have noisy data, especially noisy data that are on the margins, this might actually lead to incorrect merging of clusters. Because imagine this case, if I have a noisy data here, hierarchical clustering using single linkage, we'll notice that the distance between the two clusters is pretty short, and it might actually combine them together, which may or may not be true. So that's something to keep in mind. On the other hand, linkage functions, such as, for example, average or centroid, they basically look at all the data instances within a particular cluster, so they are more immune against outliers. Just to give you an example, this is one data set. It's pretty small. It's listing data from 1973 on protein consumption in 25 countries in Europe. Different countries have been kind of ranked in terms of different types of sources of protein that they use. And when you apply hierarchical clustering, you can see that based on how similar the patterns of protein consumption of people of countries are, they kind of are grouped together. So for example, based on this data, seems like Portugal and Spain, people have very similar habits. Likewise, Italy and Greece. And then Romania and Yugoslavia are actually very, very close. Notice that they are linked at this distance, which is lower than the distance in which Spain and Portugal have been connected, meaning that, again, this is based on 1973 data, meaning that protein consumption patterns of Yugoslavia and Romania is actually much more similar than that of Portugal and Spain. Or for example, Italy and Greece have more similar patterns than Portugal and Spain. But then as you can see, this nested structure that these countries are more similar, and then these four will be more similar compared to, for example, what you have in Albania, Bulgaria, and so on. And then if you end up having this dendrogram, you can decide how many clusters you want to have. So if my metric is to, for example, this much of distance between clusters, I draw a line and I will end up with 3 clusters, one consisting of Italy, Greece, Portugal, Spain, one consisting of Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania, and another one consisting of everybody else. If you have like a higher distance in mind, so you want your clusters to be kind of farther apart, you choose this as your cutoff line, and that'll give you 2 clusters. Lastly, we talk about another technique called density-based clustering. One of the kind of shortcomings of distance-based clusterings is that the shape of the clusters is kind of defined by the distance function that you use. We talked about this in class, that if you use, for example, Euclidean distance as your distance metric, the clusters are going to be spherical in shape, right? So the idea in density-based clustering is to allow some, unusual and arbitrarily shaped clusters to form, not necessarily clusters that are spherical in shape, right? So I want to have clusters that have shapes like this. Here what I do is I basically identify the dense regions in the data and then combine them together. This way I will create what I refer to as the pseudo data points. And then these data points, or rather pseudo data points, become the building blocks for constructing those clusters that are now arbitrarily shaped and not necessarily like circular or spherical in shape. One example for density-based clustering is methods known as grid-based methods. So here what we do is we discretize the data into multiple intervals. Let's call those intervals M. So here, for example, I am dividing the x-axis to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 regions and y-axis into 3 regions. So this means that I will have, if my data set is p-dimensional, I will have p times m hypercubes. In this case, it will be squares, but if it's a higher dimensional than 2, like 3-dimensional and above, you will have hypercubes. Once you have those hypercubes, you will have to decide on a density threshold. We call it tau. You look at each of those hypercubes, and if you have more data points than tau in that hypercube, you consider that hypercube to be dense. Otherwise, it's not going to be dense. And then the regions that are dense, if they are sharing, for example, one side with one another, you basically connect them together and they become a pseudo data point. So let's look at it through this example. Example on the left, imagine my tau is, let's say, 4. If tau is 4, I will have, let's use a different color. So I will have this cell marked as dense because I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This one marked as dense, this one marked as dense, this is dense, this is dense, and this is dense, right? So now what you do is you combine these together and they become your new data set. Now, I'm sorry, new pseudo data points. You notice here, however, that in this example, I unintentionally created a jumbo cluster that is completely irrelevant because this cell, this one, and this one, and this one, all of them will be connected to one another in terms of one single cluster, which in reality is not the case because these blue data points have nothing to do with the red data points. The problem is that the intervals that I defined were not granular enough. If you notice that, let's look at the example on the right. If I go with more granular kind of squares, then you will see that, for example, this is dense, this is dense, this is dense, this is dense, right? So these are all dense, but not this, not this, not this. So because these are not dense, the algorithm will not connect the blue cells to the red cells. This goes to show you that the choice for both m and tau, remember m is the size of those squares or hypercubes, and tau is the threshold for density. That choice is actually a very, very important choice and has practical implications. For example, if your m is small, it means that in one square or one hypercube, you might have data points that belong to multiple clusters, but they just end up being in the same region, as I showed you in this example. Let me use a different color so it stands out. So in this example, I have in this guy, I have both red data points and blue. Because m is small, I only have 5 here and 3 here. In that square, I have both green, red and blue. On the other hand, when m is large, you might have a lot of empty grid regions, and this might actually cause some of the natural clusters to be disconnected from one another. You probably cannot see it well in this example, but let's say, let me give you one example here perhaps. Let's say I have some data points here and here, right? So let's say these are naturally belonging to the same cluster, but because my m is very, very large, meaning that I have broken the data into very granular squares, this guy ends up to be identified as non-dense. Because it's not dense, the algorithm thinks that this one is not related to this one, which in reality it is. So choice of m is actually quite important, and it's something that you have to do through trial and error, and then you validate your cluster and come back. If you're not happy with that, you come back and change the choice of m. The choice of tau is also quite important. If tau is very small, a lot of individual regions are going to be merged with one another, forming a single cluster. Imagine if in this example my tau was 1, any square in which I had even one data point would be merged with the neighboring one. So meaning that even if that data point was noise, I would still combine it with other data points to form a cluster, which obviously is not ideal. On the other hand, if you have a very large number for tau, it might miss a lot of patterns. It might see, let's say my tau is 10, even if I have like 8 data points, which might be actually quite a valid kind of concentration of data points, it might still consider it as a non-dense region. So both choices of m and tau are extremely important here. and you often have to decide on those either based on some expert knowledge about the problem at hand, or through trial and error. Um, One of the practical considerations related to grid-based methods is that typically when you choose a tau, you choose it globally. So that density threshold is defined for the entire data set. This might actually be a little bit problematic, as you can see in this diagram. For example, in this case, if tau is very high, C, this cluster here, which is not dense at all, is very sparsely populated, might be missed completely, might be denoted as noise. On the other hand, if tau is low, it's possible that the algorithm might actually merge A and B together, because these parts of the space, instead of identifying it as non-dense regions, it might think that these are dense regions and combines it together. So when you have data sets where density changes from one area to another, perhaps using these grid-based methods is not the best approach, and you would instead use a distance-based algorithm, for example, like the different techniques that we talked about last time. So we're going to stop here, and these are a series of very good references that I use for creating this lecture, and I suggest that you refer to those to get more examples and more details on what we talked about.